Welcome to another episode of Keep It Fictional, the book podcast for book lovers by book lovers. Today, I am your host, Corene, and joined as ever by two of my lovely book friends, Sadie and Al. And I am very excited today because we are talking about one of the topics of my hyperfixation. We're talking about art, people. And I thought that I would start it like high school essay style of asking, what is art? Is it something that we all recognize in the same way that Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart said in his landmark ruling on pornography, I know it when I see it? Or is it something that can be objectively judged? What makes great art? Why do we make art? What makes an artist an artist? What makes art art and not craft? What's the difference between art and craft? And who gets to decide? So, human beings have been creating art from the very beginning. In fact, the oldest piece of art that we have found or that has survived is the ochre paintings of 3 wild boars painted on the walls of a limestone cave on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi. These depictions are 45,000 years old. If you think about the Lascaux caves, they're only 17,000 years old. We've been creating art for religious or ceremonial reasons. If you think about the Dutch masters that we're all so fond of, they created art for straight up profit and money. It could be for fun. Some actually theorize that the Easter Island moai were created just as kind of like a make work fun project. Every 2 years, we just gather around and make a giant head for funsies. It has been made to commemorate great battles. It has been made to communicate royalty and a blessing from heaven. It's a symbol of power. If you think about Korean folding screens, they show that the divine right of the king is legitimate and right. They can show power or love or victory or defeat. Making art makes us human. And I would argue, and am going to argue, that art, the appreciation and understanding of, is intrinsically tied with literary explanations, with literary works, because we aren't necessarily born innately with the keys to understanding art. We have to be taught how to see and how to interpret art. Every piece of art is a story. It's a piece of history. It was created in a specific time, in a specific place by a specific people. It's a product of culture. The symbolism, unless it is explained to us, unless we're part of that culture and time, is lost to us. And it's also the individual story and vision of an artist. And without an explanation or context, you can't really understand it on a deeper level. We look at it, we see globs of paint on a canvas, and we feel maybe something, but probably nothing. I would argue with art, context is everything. And I want to give you an example of one of my favorite pieces of art. So you walk into a gallery, and on a white painted wall, there are 2 clocks. These are regular office clocks that you could buy at Staples. They have a black rim on them, and they are placed touching side by side on the wall. They are the most boring clocks in the world. You probably paid $7.99 for them. The clocks at the beginning of the exhibit are synchronized. So they're showing the exact same time. Now, over the course of the exhibit, over the slow creep of time, these clocks will fall out of sync with each other. Now, you look at these clocks on the wall, which anyone could do, and you read the plaque. It's by Felix Gonzalez Torres. It's made in 1991, and it is called Untitled Bracket Perfect Lovers. Now, what if I told you that this piece of art is valued at $7.7 million? Now, to look at this, you would probably feel nothing. It's two clocks. It's modern art. Modern art is nonsensical. But if you read into the context of it, I think you can see why this actual piece of art is so affecting. So first is that in 1991, there was a lot of feelings that art, public money should not be spent on gay art or gay artists. And so many believe that this was a protest against the censorship of gay art, using everyday found objects, putting it up on the wall and saying, we can make art with whatever we have. The second is the personal history of the artist. So in 1987, Gonzalez Torres's partner, Ross, oh no, my own writing is so bad. Ross Laycock was diagnosed with AIDS. And if you think about those two clocks touching in perfect sync with each other until one slowly falls out of sync. And when he was designing this, he kind of wrote about it as he was conceptualizing this piece. And he wrote about this piece, I believe, to Laycock. Don't be afraid of the clocks. They are our time. The time has been so generous to us. We imprinted time with the sweet taste of victory. We conquered fate by meeting at a certain time in a certain place. We are a product of the time. Therefore, we give back credit where it is due, time. We are synchronized now, forever. I love you. So the context of this art is everything. And that's why seeing art is one aspect to it, but reading about it and contextualizing it is the other key to really appreciating it on a human level. So we are lucky today that we are going to be looking at 3 books about art, about artists, and even maybe about stealing art. So I'm very excited to see what our fellow art appreciators have come up with today. So I am going to swing it over to Al to get us started.
All right. So today I'm going to talk about a book about art, about artists, but most of all about the color blue. This book is Sacre Bleu, a comedy d'art by Christopher Moore. We learn a little bit of history of the color blue as the book goes on, especially ultramarine blue, the sacred blue, the blue of Mother Mary's cloak, as dictated in the 13th century, one of the rarest colors of paint available. True ultramarine blue is made from crushed lapis lazuli, a stone that could not be found in most parts of the world, including France, where our story takes place. We open in Auvers, France, July 1890, with a different story than the one we may have heard. Vincent van Gogh sets up his easel at the intersection of 3 roads and begins to paint. But there is a sound behind him, a rustling, and a twisted little man emerges from the corn. It is the color man, capital C, and the sight of him terrifies Vincent. You owe me a painting, the color man tells the painter, and Vincent tells him he burned it. When he looks back at the color man, he is now holding a gun, and he threatens to shoot Vincent if he doesn't tell him where the painting is. Vincent lies again, says it's a painting of a church hanging in an inn nearby. The color man can tell he's lying, but is distracted by a drop of rain. Vincent flicks a paintbrush, spattering paint into the color man's face. But the color man's gun goes off accidentally, shooting Vincent in the chest. Terrified and angry, the colorman throws his gun to the ground and runs off into the corn. Vincent takes a tube of ultramarine blue from his palette and staggers to the nearby doctor's house a mile away. There, later, with his brother Theo at his side, he dies. Far away in Montmartre, Paris, Lucien Lassalle is helping out his father's bakery when the news comes of Vincent's death. He's stricken by the news, as Vincent is one of many artists with whom he is acquainted through his father's love for art and feeding starving artists. Lucien goes to try and find another painter friend of his, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, to tell him about what happened. He tries Henri's house, he tries the Moulin Rouge, the restaurant Le Rameau, but finally finds him at a brothel on Rue d'Amboise, where he has apparently been for the last 3 days. Henri is with one of the brothel's women, apparently in high spirits, but his mood clouds over when he receives the news of Vincent's death. The two go for lunch, but as they are discussing Vincent's death, a woman appears outside. Juliette, the woman who stole Lucien's heart 2.5 years ago and broke it by disappearing seemingly off the face of the earth. Henri warns him against it, but Lucien immediately runs to her, falling back in love instantly. As the book goes on, Lucien falls under Juliette's spell, and at her urging begins to paint her. She brings him paint as gifts, including tubes of ultramarine blue. Henri becomes suspicious when he sees Juliette in the company of the colormen, though, who Vincent had written to him about, and begins to try and separate Lucien and Juliette, as well as to investigate who the colorman really is, and whether or not he had something to do with Vincent's death and Lucien's increasing obsession with Juliette. Meanwhile, as Juliette continues to act as Lucien's muse, strange things begin to happen, slips in time and space that Lucien doesn't quite have the wherewithal to consider strange. Lucien starts to spend all his time with Juliette and none of his time working in his family's bakery, worrying his family and Henri all the more. Eventually, his mother lies in wait outside Lucien's impromptu studio, and when Juliette emerges, she hits her over the head with a crepe pan and goes in to recover her sleeping son. When they go to see what happened to Juliette, she has disappeared. Lucien lies unconscious for 8 days, and when he wakes up, Henri and Camille Pissarro are there. Together, they begin to piece together that they all have missing memories and strange feelings, and all of them are connected to the color blue and the strange color man. Henri and Lucien then begin to work together to investigate the color man and Vincent's death, and the story goes on from there. So I've read a few books by Christopher Moore, and this one is probably my favorite of his. Christopher Moore is known for comedy books for the most part. He's written Fool and Blood-Sucking Fiends, a love story, a trilogy about vampires in modern day. He's written Lamb, which is a sort of comedy reinterpretation of the life of Jesus. But while this book is funny at times, comedy isn't really the centerpiece. Instead, you get to see Moore's obvious love of Impressionist art and a well-researched, well-plotted mystery set in 19th century France, with almost surreal aspects of fantasy woven in throughout, especially surrounding Juliette and the color blue and the color man, with occasional asides about the history of ultramarine blue and of art and of color theory. One of my favorite parts about this book is that it's in full color. The text is all dark blue, which is very noticeable when you begin, but after a short while becomes completely background and something you don't even notice, which I think is a great structural reference to the plot of the novel itself. As well, there are full color reproductions of paintings by the artists referenced in the novel. Some of these paintings are referred to specifically in the text. Other times they're just related to what's going on. They are very small and matte on the page. I'll just show an example here for those of you who are watching on Facebook. But this book really made me appreciate the Impressionist art style even more than I already did, and makes me really want to go traveling to see some of these pieces in person. It really comes like what really shines through here is the love of art and the love of art history and the love of what it is that makes us create art. What is it that makes us want to create art even when we're not making any money, even when it's not bringing us anything material in life, but it brings us something in the heart. Um, this is a great book. I highly recommend it. It's very funny at times, and it's just a really well written piece of work. And also, just as a physical object, I highly recommend picking up this book just to read it and to see all the paintings, to see the blue text. Um, I think it's a good experience of a book as a physical piece of art as well.
Nice. Very, very nice. Yeah, if you're interested in kind of like the history of the physical process of making color, there is a really great book called The Secret Lives of Color by Cassia St. Clair, which goes into all the different colors and gives you little pieces of history about like where do we get like arsenic green from? What is the history of this particular shade of gold? And the edges of all the pages are actually the colors, so you kind of like flip through and find a
Ooh,
color that
that's so
interests
cool.
you. It's oh it's such a delightful book, really enjoyable just to kind of flip through and get these little snippets of history. I really suggest that. And then if you're looking at it from like an artistic side of view, Joseph Albert's color theory, he's the boss of. The Interaction of Color is another book where he talks about his particular idea was like the juxtaposition of colors by each other to elicit an emotion or feeling, which is kind of I think what this book is looking at, how a particular color, a particular pigment can make us feel an emotion, which again is a wild, wild concept. But yeah, so Joseph Albert, The Interaction of Color and the Secret Lives of Color. And funnily enough, I cannot remember I'm trying to find the actual name of the book of the person who wrote this. But there's a theory, perhaps conspiracy theory or not, that Vincent van Gogh was actually murdered, and did not take his own life. So once I find that, there's a very, very long book that he was actually taken out by children, which is a great, which is kind of a great theory. And when you hear it, it's actually quite convincing. So there's also a great BuzzFeed Unsolved episode about it. So you can treat yourself to that if you are interested. Um, Al, I'm curious. You said you had a great appreciation for the Impressionist artists, but my existential question for you is like, what is your favorite piece of art?
I think I'm going to have to pick a piece of art by the Impressionists. I love them so much, and Vincent van Gogh is one of my favorite artists of all time. I think I'm going to have to say I can't remember the exact title, but it's The Crows Over the Cornfield. I just I think it's an underrated painting of Vincent van Gogh's because everyone knows Starry Night, everyone knows that painting of the church, everyone knows the sunflowers, but the crows over the field just has this sort of melancholy to it that I really appreciate. And it's one of the few that I believe I've seen in person. When I was a child, my family did a big trip to Europe and we got to go to a lot of museums. And one of the things we would do, or my parents would do to keep me and my brother occupied, was take us to the gift shop first. And then we would pick a postcard with a piece of art from the gallery and we would have to go find it. And it was actually really engaging. And it really was a fun way to sort of get us interested in the art that we were going to see and get us more engaged with what we were doing.
I'm gonna hold on to that one. That's that's a good idea. And already Evie loves search and find things, so I feel like that's gonna be it's gonna be a good one. Thank you.
It's really genius. Like it's really clever. Oh, smart. Um, okay, well, speaking of art galleries, I am going to talk about my book, which I'm very excited to do. Um, I love reading about art. I think there's the side of like artist creation, there's the context of art, but then there's also like the art world, which is something that is very different and separate from art. And the question of exactly like who decides what art is one that we should all struggle with, because the history of what is determined to be art or what is determined to be craft, and why craft is usually denigrated to a separate category, is the story of sexism and racism and colonialism. What is determined to be great art is is frighteningly determined by a small handful of very rich old white men. They decide what is art, they decide what is worthwhile art, they decide how much that art is worth, and who is an artist and who is simply a craftsman. I mean, if you look at the beautiful like basket weaving of indigenous artists, or even the wireframe statues of like Ruth Asawa, why are those put into a separate and lesser category than a statue in marble? Why? Who decides that? How come? What's the reason? And I think that that is always worth examining, um, especially because art galleries, and the art world is, I'm going to put the word allegedly for like legal reasons. It's allegedly extremely corrupt. And if you would like to delve into exactly how corrupt it is, but also the history of the people both of it and exploiting of it, boy, do I have a book for you. So let me tell you this. Stealing art is easy. Stealing art is almost painfully easy. There is a fantastic book. I believe it's called Art and Madness, but I will look it up and let you know, about a French thief. I believe his name is pronounced Brizard. Over a course of a number of years, he stole 200 pieces of art, statues, sculptures, some paintings, worth estimated to be about $1.4 billion. Was kind of caught twice trying to smuggle art out, but the police were like, "Oh, it's your first time. Don't worry about it. Just don't do it again." Um, Again, we think 200 pieces of art, and it is almost comically easy to steal art and antiquities. All you have to do is you have to have a little bit of boldness, a dash of audacity, and a calm and steady hand. The security in most museums and art galleries is light. And as long as you go on the lunch where there's less tourists around and the security guards are doing their lunch break, so there's less of them around, as long as you have a big jacket, you can essentially walk away with anything. Even the great institutes that we think are the most safe are not, as we have recently learned from the British Museum, who are missing 1,500 objects that they only recently discovered are missing when one of the coins showed up on eBay. And someone who worked there was like, "Wait a minute, don't we own this?" And the question was, "You did." So when something of great value goes missing, who do you call? Well, strangely enough, you call the FBI. And for a long time, I mean, according to him, but I actually genuinely believe this, the only person that really cared, was Robert K. Wittman. So most countries don't care about art theft because in the grand scheme of things, it's a victimless crime. They're really busy going after real bad guys who are, dealing in drugs or arms or human trafficking. So like art kind of falls like on the low end of things that they're really caring about. And this was the same case with the FBI, who just were like, well, is it 25 kilos of cocaine? No, okay, it's a painting. Like, get over it. Even though a lot of this art and antiquities are stolen and sold to fund organized crime, hence the corruption part of the art world. And so when things went missing, they called Robert K. Wittman, who was a specialist in the FBI, on how to go undercover to retrieve art. Trying to catch the thieves is a little bit tricky. Again, as I said, stealing art is easy. It's easy. You and I could do this. You don't need a specialized team. You just need to literally just like yank it off the wall and walk out. The difficult part is selling it, especially if it's a well-known painting. And one of the many facts that I learned from this fantastic book is that the resale value, especially of a very well-known painting, is only about 10%. So you could steal the screen worth $75 million by, again, walking into the gallery, picking it up, and walking out. But when you try to sell it to an undercover FBI agent, the price that you are going to get for that $75 million painting is $750,000 only. The stealing is the tough part, and that is what Robert K. Wittman realized. You can't really target the thieves and track them down so much as you try to catch them when they're trying to offload all of their art. And so this is what he did. Priceless: How I Went Undercover to Rescue the World's Stolen Treasures, by Robert K. Wittman with John Shiffman, is the story of his career. How he came to be interested in art, how he came to found the FBI's art crime team, as well as to go into the stories of some very, very famous art heists that he was able to recover and tragically not able to recover. So he has been involved in some absolutely wild cases of art theft, including a collection of like Norman Rockwell paintings that became of like significant national attention after 9/11. And I think that's what I really liked about this book, is that he really keys into why art is important to people, to a nation, how symbolic it is. I think one of the most he kind of details his life and then goes through various kind of like crimes that he was not involved with. No, let me run that back. Art thefts that he helped recover. Yep, he was not involved. Including a really touching story of a flag, like a regimental flag that actually belonged to the 12th Regiment Infantry Corps d'Afrique. So this was one of the first units of Black soldiers for the unit. And this flag went missing from the museum and was lost until it showed up on the black market. And so Robert Wittman went undercover to retrieve this flag and return it back to the community. And for them, that's an important symbol that means something to this collector who is well aware of its history. It just was a price tag, a potential payday. But for those people, it really, really meant something. This is, as I said, like a wild ride through the black market of the art world, how art gets stolen, how art gets traded. There is a copy of the Bill of Rights that he tracks down. There are eagle feathers and headdresses from indigenous groups, which again has its own separate black market. It goes through the loopholes that thieves and organized crime exploit to cross antiquities over international borders, where all of a sudden it's not so illegal anymore. He goes through how essentially, because organizations and countries don't work together, they know how to get around this to make a theft or a looting of an archaeological site suddenly very legal in London. And again, goes over all these holes in different organizations that make it very easy for the people working there to steal stuff, including your layman. He himself has a very fascinating history. His mother was Japanese, his father was white and American, and kind of has such an interesting perspective on like the particular time in history that he grew up with, talking about his mother's experience and his father's experience and why he was interested in art and why he sees art as so integral to give back to the people that it came from because it's a piece of history. And so when these people steal something, they are stealing that person's culture and they are stealing that person's history. And I think that's what kind of really drives him in this career to give these things back to the people that it belongs to. British Museum. Um, so if you love a heist story, if you love a heist story, and he does go into the Isabella Stewart Garden Museum heist, which is the greatest art heist of all time. And again, he thinks he came really close to retrieving those paintings. Whether you believe that or not, who knows? If you're interested in crime, if you're interested in kind of like how law enforcement approaches this, if you're interested in like undercover stories and like a thriller, this book kind of has everything. It is written with John Shiffman, who is his kind of like ghostwriter or writer. It reads like a thriller. It's an absolute rip-roaring ride. I enjoyed every minute of it. It's so enjoyable. You learn a little bit about art. You learn a little bit about history. You kind of learn one person's kind of trajectory in their career to do something very specialized and interesting. And you see how one man kind of like falls in love with art itself. So if you are looking for kind of like the dark side of art and how easy it is to steal things, I would definitely recommend Priceless with Robert K. Whitman. Yes, we got a little bit of nonfiction, we got a little bit of fiction, and now Sadie, are you going to bring us a YA fantasy that has to do with magical paint?
Well, Corene, now that you mention it, no, I'm not. Sorry, I'm not. The book that I'm going to be talking about is called The Swan Thieves by Elizabeth Kostova. So this is a historical fiction, but it kind of has the elements that I really, really like, where one part of the story is in one time period, one part of the story is in another. You're kind of trying to solve some sort of mystery, answer some sort of question by looking back and kind of learning what happened in this original time period that caused all of these things to happen in future. So I actually read this book originally, I think 5 or 6 years ago, and I think it may have been the first Elizabeth Kostova book that I read, and I will say it is not my favorite of her books, but it did encourage me to read more of her work. So I liked it enough that I did kind of inspire me to try and find more of her things. And so the story takes place in a few, as I mentioned, a few different time periods, but the kind of present day time is 1999. And our story follows Dr. Andrew Marlowe, who is a very successful psychiatrist, and he lives in Washington, D.C. Now, as I said, this is not the only story that Kostova tells in this book, but it is where we start our story. Marlowe lives alone, doesn't really have a lot of friends or loved ones or family around. He's okay with that, though. He focuses on his patients. He focuses on his work. In his downtime, he focuses on his one true hobby and passion, which is painting. And so he spends all of his time when he's not with his patients painting or visiting art galleries. So one morning, April 1999, Marlowe receives a phone call from an old colleague, a good friend of his, asking Marlowe if he can transfer the care of one of his new patients into Marlowe's care. And the reason that he's wanting to transfer this patient's care is because this patient is a painter. And he hopes that because Marlowe is also a painter, they might be able to connect on some level, and Marlowe might be able to help this patient. So the patient in question is Robert Oliver. As I mentioned, he is a painter himself, and he had recently been arrested because a week earlier he tried to attack and destroy a painting in the National Gallery. The painting was called Leda and the Swan, and it was by Gilbert Thomas. So he tried to attack it with a knife. Maybe not quite as easy as stealing a painting. Attacking a painting did get a little bit more attention, and he was arrested. And after kind of being put on a very quick trial and being assessed a little bit, they transferred his care to a psychiatrist. So Marlowe is very curious as to why Robert attacked this painting. And so he agrees to take on Robert's care and he starts sessions. Robert refuses to say anything. They sit there in silence. Finally, Robert admits that yes, he is a painter. And he tells Marlowe that if he knew anything about his life, he would completely understand why he wanted to destroy that painting. That's it. That's the only thing that he will say. So after many more sessions, Marlowe eventually decides to give him painting supplies. He's a painter after all. Maybe he can use that passion and use that strength of Robert's to try and get through to him. So he gives him painting supplies, he gives him canvas, he gives him paints, but all that Robert will paint is the same woman over and over and over and over again. He won't say who this woman is. He still won't say anything else. All he does is paint this woman over and over again. So Marlowe is getting very, very frustrated. And in this moment of frustration, he makes a decision. He makes a decision that he will not be able to go back from. He decides to bend the rules just a little bit. He decides to push past his legal and ethical boundaries just a little bit so that he can figure out why Robert is acting the way he is. This starts by Marlowe going through Robert's belongings. So Robert is staying in a psychiatric hospital. And so as his doctor, Marlowe does have access to his room and he has access to his belongings. And so Marlowe decides to go through his belongings. He finds a bundle of letters. They're written in the 19th century, and they're written from a woman named Beatrice to her great uncle, Oliver Vigneault. Robert is very, very protective of them. Realizing now that what he learned from these letters only provided more questions and no answers, Marlowe once again breaches Robert's privacy. So he reaches out to Robert's ex-wife, Kate, to see what she can tell him about Robert's past and about Robert's obsession with the woman in his paintings. So now we go to Kate. Kate first met Robert in 1984 in New York City. Their first meeting was not great, far from ideal. In fact, it may have been the most humiliating moment of Kate's life. She introduced herself to Robert in the Lord and Taylor store by accidentally vomiting onto his shoes. Now, this could have been the end of their encounter, but Robert, while he was very upset about the vomit on his shoes, more about the shoes themselves, which he had specially made, than the actual vomit, he does decide that he's not going to leave Kate to be suffering in the middle of the Lord and Taylor. So he makes sure that Kate gets home safely. The next day, after Kate has recovered from her humiliation, she calls Robert. She calls Robert to say thank you. In this phone call, she learns that both her and Robert are artists, and they start to connect on that. Now, once they have connected, before long, they are living together in Kate's small Brooklyn apartment. 5 years later, they're married, she's pregnant, and they're moving to North Carolina. Now, this is when Kate first starts to worry about Robert's obsession. She realizes before they move that Robert has not packed a single item other than his painting. He just doesn't care about it. He has left absolutely everything behind except for his painting. Even more so, when they're on the road, Kate sees a picture of something. She sees a picture, a hand-drawn sketch of a woman. She's never met this woman before. She doesn't recognize her. But from the way that the painting, or from the way that the drawing has been done, it's very clear that Robert is very familiar with her. This is just the beginning of the downfall of their relationship. And it's just the beginning of Robert's obsession with Beatrice de Clerval-Vignon. Now, in 1877, Beatrice was living the typical life of a Parisian wife. Her husband, Yves, is out all day. He often works late. Well, at least that's what he tells her, although Beatrice doesn't really have any proof on the matter. She also doesn't have any reason to believe otherwise. But, she finds that she doesn't really care. If he chooses to spend his days at a certain kind of club, then that's his choice. And Beatrice finds that it actually gives her a little bit of a relief. Now, when they're together, Yves takes Beatrice out to the opera, to drink champagne, to a ball in the heart of the city. He always encourages her. He always loves to have her around and loves to show her off. And he, most of all, encourages her love of painting. He thinks that it's good for her to have something to do while she is home all day long while he is at work. He thinks that she needs something that will make her happy. Now, Beatrice has never told him that this hobby of hers is more than that, and that she dreams of one day submitting her paintings to the salons of Paris. Because painting does make her happy. When she's painting, she is able to see the world differently. She's able to see the world as a canvas itself, of the colors to be matched and created on her palette. And she'll spend hours trying to find and create the perfect blue to match the dress of the maid that she's trying to paint. However, painting is not all that she loves, and it's not all that she looks forward to during her days. What she truly waits for every day is for the mail to arrive, because she knows that she will receive a letter from him, her mentor, her lover, a man who is old enough to be her grandfather, but of that Beatrice does not care. All that she cares about is what he can teach her about herself, about art, and about life. So Kostova intertwines all three of these stories. She intertwines the present-day setting where Marlowe is trying to find answers. And then we see Kate's reminiscence of her and Robert's life together, interspersed with letters, the letters that Marlowe found of Beatrice's communication with her uncle. And we slowly start to unravel the secrets surrounding this painting, Leda and the Swan. We start to learn more about Beatrice's life. We start to learn more about her connection to her uncle and the painting that she was able to do under his mentorship. And we start to learn why Robert felt like he needed to destroy this painting. Now, as he learns more, Marlowe finds himself being pulled further and further into Robert's and Beatrice's stories and into their lives, and unfortunately, into their obsessions. And he allows their obsessions to become his own. He starts to realize that if he's not careful, he will get lost in these obsessions in the exact same way that both Beatrice did and that Robert did. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is probably not my favorite Kostova book, but I really enjoyed it. I loved the mystery aspects of it. I found that as a reader, you're pulled into the obsession of all of the characters, and it's kind of one of those situations where you're glad that there's an ending to the book, because if there wasn't an ending, you don't know how long you would kind of stay in that world. It's a 600-page book, so it's a bit of a longer book, but I found that it moves along very quickly because you're just wanting to find out more about all three of these stories. I did struggle with the relationship between Beatrice and her great uncle, so I think that there is definitely room for content warning there if that is something that you are uncomfortable with. That storyline does play quite a strong role in the story. And so I would say maybe stay away from this book if you're not comfortable with that. But as I said, I loved the mystery aspects. I loved the puzzles that Marlowe was trying to figure out, and the way Kostova puts all of these pieces together to answer all of the questions. And she uses kind of all three of these stories to build suspense in a really big way to draw everyone in. So yeah, I think if you're looking for something historical, a little bit of a puzzle, a little bit of a mystery, also a bit of psychological aspects, as all of three of our kind of protagonists are dealing with this obsession and struggling with kind of what is happening to them in their lives as they give into this obsession. It definitely brings in kind of those more psychological aspects to it. Then yeah, I would recommend The Swan Thieves by Elizabeth Kostova.
Interesting. And if you are interested in pursuing a nonfiction view of obsession with art, the book that I was talking about was The Art Thief, The True Story of Love, Crime, and a Dangerous Obsession by Michael Finkel. And if you want to see whether Van Gogh was murdered by children or not, Van Gogh, The Life by Stephen Nathan and Gregory White Smith. And it's funny, when you said The Swan Thief, I thought you were going to be talking about, there's a very famous true crime case of someone who stole feathers, just feathers, famous, very expensive feathers, called The Feather Thief by Kirk Wallace Johnson. But you took a very different turn, very, very different turn.
I just helped someone find that book yesterday. Yeah, that's very strange.
What a coincidence. And maybe they're going to get into feather theft because, again, museums don't do inventory, so it's very easy. So Sadie, I want to ask you, like, what is your favorite piece of art?
Okay, so I actually changed my mind during our book talk today, and I'm going to mention both of them. So my original choice went back to, again, an Impressionist painting, and this is one that my parents had hanging in our living room for as long as I can remember. And they got it at the Met gift shop, a print of like a big full-size print of this painting. And it is now technically in my house, although when I first put it up on the wall in our current place, it fell down and the glass broke, and I have not been able to get it fixed yet. So it is not currently on the wall in our house, but I do own this painting given to me by my mother when I moved into one of my apartments when I was in university. So the painting is Girls at a Piano by Renoir. And the reason I love this painting is because it always reminded me of me and my sister. Because I have light hair, she has dark hair. We had a piano growing up, and we always had it in our house. And I always thought that it was a painting of me and my sister, knowing I knew it wasn't actually, but that was what made me think of it. But actually, I changed my mind to one that an artist that I was introduced to actually from my daughter's picture books. And this is a BC artist, a First Nations artist who does the most beautiful paintings of West Coast kind of scenery and West Coast life. And it's Roy Henry Vickers. And he just uses the most beautiful colors and the most kind of to create these amazing atmospheric prints of West Coast life. And so I think that his work I'm starting to really, really love. And I don't have any prints of his yet. I realized that I would always get my mom a calendar for Christmas, and it was his calendar. And so once I kind of read these children books that he has out, I put those two together. And so I think that I will be looking for some prints of his to have, because they're beautiful.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sadie.
What about you, Corene?
Well, I mentioned it at the beginning. In fact, Untitled Perfect Lovers, when Felix Gonzalez was talking about it later, he knew, and it was designed that eventually the clocks would fall out of sync. So they're a mechanical object and they're run by batteries. And of course, batteries, like human lives, have different lifespans. And so he said about this, time is something that scares me, or used to. This piece was made with 2 clocks, was the scariest thing that I have ever done. I wanted to face it. I wanted those 2 clocks right in front of me, ticking. Felix Gonzalez's partner, Laycock, died in 1991 of AIDS-related illness. Felix Gonzalez Torres passed away in 1996 of AIDS-related illness. However, because of this piece of art, those two clocks touching, slowly ticking away, those two mechanical heartbeats keep going forever, together, out of sync, until they are brought back to life again, over and over, every time that this piece is shown. They live on. Their love, their devotion to each other is immortal forever. So I hope that you have enjoyed this multitudinous look at the art world. There is so much to explore, so many artists, so many stories, so much history to delve into, that I hope you get some inspiration from this. Thank you so much to my fellow book friends, and thank you so much for listening. We hope that you are inspired to pick up a book about art, or maybe even pick up a paintbrush yourself. Have lovely reading, everyone.